Okay, so in this video, we're going to look at the similarities and differences in the market for private goods, which we looked at in the previous videos, with the market for human labor, with the market for work which is needed to complete a task. So when it comes to your professional lives, I feel like the content in this video is important because if you understand how supply and demand operate in labor markets, then you can understand how employment decisions should be made should you ever be in the position of determining payroll, determining human resources, helping your company hire people, or how the hiring decisions are being made when you are an employee looking for a job. When we think about the importance of this video in making the world a better place, seeing that one of the goals of macroeconomic policy and one of the objectives that we may have when we try to create a utopian society is full employment, then if we understand how the labor market operates, then we can understand impediments to full employment. We can try to work around them so we can create a society where anybody who wants a job can have a job. And importantly, we also need to make clear the distinctions between labor markets and private goods markets so that when in this class you are asked a question about a labor market, you don't confuse it with the private goods market and mistake the supply of labor for the demand for labor, for example. And that will be a relatively easy mistake to make if we're not familiar with this material, as we'll show on the next couple slides. So let's start by taking a look at an example of a supply and demand graph in a labor market. Now, the first thing that should be obvious is that this does share many similarities with the supply and demand graph in the private goods market for products. That we have an L-shaped axis, we have a variable on the horizontal axis and a variable on the vertical axis, and largely those are similar to what we see in private goods. So on the horizontal axis, we once again have quantity, which could always be represented by Q, though in labor markets, we'll often see this as an L, representing the amount of labor needed, the quantity of labor demanded, the quantity of labor supplied. And this can either be represented in the number of workers or the number of hours of work needed. Now on the vertical axis, it's going to look a little bit different. You'll see here that we have salary. Now salary is still going to be the price of the good which is traded, which is here labor. So you would think that we would have an S on the vertical axis instead of a P. But more often than not, we're going to have a W. And the W is going to represent wages, and wages are your per hour pay, whereas a salary is a per year pay. Now we can make a relatively simple conversion between salary and wages by relying on the assumption that the typical American has a 40-hour work week. They work 50 weeks a year with 2 weeks of vacation or holidays. And so that adds up to about 2,000 hours per year. And if we multiply their hourly wage, such as $10 an hour, by the amount of hours they work in a year, then we can move from the wage to a salary. And similarly, if we know their annual salary, such as $60,000 a year, then we can move from salary to wages by dividing that by 2,000. So if you're earning $60,000 a year, we divide that by 2,000, and your hourly wage roughly works out to be $30 an hour. However, if we really want to understand how labor markets operate, then it's going to be best not to think of the vertical axis as representing salary or wages, but of total compensation. And so this is going to include not only salary and wages, but also the benefits which employers provide through paid time off, through tenure, through health insurance and retirement. So that's really going to show the true price which is going to set quantity demanded of labor equal to the quantity supplied. Now, speaking of the quantity demand of labor and the quantity supplied of labor, let's take a look at the actual supply and demand curves for labor. Now, what we'll notice in this graph that there are these same equilibrating mechanisms that will push wages or compensation down or up depending on shortages or surpluses. So if we think of this hypothetical market for the labor of nurses, then if the annual salary in this case is $75,000 and we think of the equilibrium salary as being $70,000, then there will be more nurses willing to work at a wage of $75,000, at a salary of $75,000, than there are the demand of positions for those nurses. Similarly, if the salary that's being offered is $60,000, then there's not going to be enough nurses willing to work. That the quantity of nurses supplied is going to be less than the quantity of nurses demanded, which means that there's going to be a shortage of nurses. And so when there is a shortage, that puts upward pressure on salaries, and hospitals now have to compete with each other to hire more nurses. They have a higher quantity demanded, so they will offer a higher salary and try to steal some nurses from another hospital or pull them into the labor market. Similarly, when there's too many nurses relative to the equilibrium salary, then hospitals may recognize that they could get by with paying the nurses less. Now, you may have noticed on the previous slide in the graph of supply and demand that who plays what role in the market gets shifted. The households, the individuals, no longer represent demand as they do in a private goods market. They now represent supply of labor. And the firms and companies, so firms here is just going to be a economics term for companies, is going to be representing the demand for labor in a labor market, but obviously the supply of goods in the private goods or product market. So because of this, the market forces which impact the demand for labor often look more like the market forces which impact the supply of private goods. And we'll make this more clear on the next slide. The last point that I want to make here is that when we think of changes in compensation and how that impacts supply and demand, we'll notice that in any market, a change in the price, a change in what is on the vertical axis, whether that's price, whether that's salary, whether that's wages, can only impact a change in the quantity demanded and quantity supplied. It's not going to impact the whole demand or supply curve. And so in this case, when there's a change in compensation, then that is going to shift the quantity of labor demanded and the quantity of labor supplied, but it's not going to shift the whole supply and demand curve. And we'll go through some practice problems over the course of the next week, which will make this more clear. So let's take a look at some market forces which would impact the entire labor demand curve or the entire labor supply curve. So when we think of the demand for output increasing, that if you work for 3M and you need to now make more masks because of the pandemic and there's a greater demand for your products, then you're going to need to hire more workers. And so the labor demand curve is going to shift outward. And that's because you need to make more products, which is going to require more labor. Technology and education are going to work in different ways here. So the more educated and better trained your workforce, that's going to make labor more efficient and will likely increase the labor demand. Whereas technology, whether as a substitute or a complement, can either increase or decrease. Improvements in technology can either increase or decrease the labor demand. We'll look at an example of this on another slide. So the number of companies is going to act similarly to the amount of the buying population in the private goods market. So if there are more companies which are hiring employees, and that's going to increase the demand for labor. Government regulations, which make it more costly to produce a good, are going to increase the marginal cost of production, are going to decrease the amount of labor typically when there are costly government regulations. Now, there may be times in which the government may mandate that work needs to be done by human hands and not by machinery, in which case that would work in the other direction. But you want to think here about whether labor is going to be a substitute or a complement for other inputs and means of production, and how we're going to need to use labor to produce a desired amount of output. Now, when we think about shifts in the labor supply curve, then we're going to think about how many workers are able and willing to work. How many are looking for jobs at every levels of compensation? Whether there are any restrictions on education which would limit the amount of workers, that if we say that nurses now no longer have to have an associate's degree, they have to have a bachelor's to work, then that is going to reduce the number of nurses which are able to work at every level of compensation, because those which previously only had associates now have to withdraw from the labor market, go back to school, and get a bachelor's. Similarly, government policies can work in different directions, and it's going to depend again on whether it's going to make it easier for people to work or make it more restrictive. So we'll look at some examples of these coming up next. Okay, so as indicated when we were going over the list of supply and demand shifters, technology is going to impact the demand for labor, but it can do so in one of two directions. In the same technological improvement or advancement can either increase the demand for labor or decrease the demand for labor, depending on which labor market we're considering. And so what I would like to do now is show how the same technological introduction, we're going to consider Microsoft Excel, could either decrease the demand for some labor or increase the demand for other labor. And so it's hard to think of a world before computers, before spreadsheeting software such as Microsoft Excel. But before that point in time, there obviously had to be more labor which would go into creating manual spreadsheets, creating manual tables and documentation of business receipts and anything that we can represent in tabular form. So that would have required more labor of office administration or administrative assistance, secretarial type work. And by introducing Excel, we didn't clearly eliminate all administrative assistants. What we did was we made them more efficient and able to do the work of multiple administrative assistants, or what would have required the work of multiple administrative assistants in the past. And so that then would decrease the demand for labor for administrative assistants, since there are now fewer positions to go around, and that is going to then lead to fewer administrative assistants. And I want to note here that low skill and high skill are often normative sounding words or terms. They sound like one of those we are valuing, the other we are not valuing. But really what we mean here is that one of them is going to have more restrictive training and education type policies to be able to work in that field, and the other one is going to be more accessible to those without higher credentials. And so when we introduce a technology which can act as a substitute for those types of jobs which don't require the credentials, then we'll see a leftward shift in the demand curve for that labor, which will reduce the number of jobs which are available and pay those who are still working those jobs a lower wage. Now, that same technology, being Microsoft Excel or spreadsheeting software, may also make white-collar type jobs of office administration being more, or I guess office executives be more efficient. Then it may allow them to analyze data in real time, may allow them to move on market opportunities at an earlier point, since they're no longer waiting for manual reports to be created. They may be automated, they may be shared with them instantly via the Excel file. And so this is going to give them opportunities which previously didn't exist, make them more efficient, and is going to increase the demand for the labor of those who are able to take advantage of this information, act as a complement to their labor, and create more jobs since they are now more valuable, and pay them a higher wage. So this is how the same technology can work in two different directions, depending on whether it's a substitute or a complement for the labor in question.